"He is just the janitor," Richard Calloway said, loud enough for every board member in the glass conference room to hear. The room laughed, not loudly. Worse, politely, the kind of laugh rich people use when they want cruelty to sound like judgment. Malcolm Hayes stood near the long walnut table on the 47th floor of Sterling North Tower in Cleveland, Ohio. He was a black man in a plain navy suit with no expensive watch, no gold pin, and no assistant walking 2 steps behind him. In one hand, he held a folded white cleaning towel. In the other, he held a black leather folder with the initials MH pressed into the corner so lightly that most people would never notice. On the wall behind Richard, a giant screen glowed in cold blue light. Final credit line approval, $50 million. Sterling North Industries needed that money before noon. They needed it to pay suppliers in Toledo and Akron. They needed it to keep 2 manufacturing plants open through the quarter. They needed it to cover a payroll cycle that had already been delayed once. They needed it because their polished presentation did not match the fear moving through the building below them. But Richard did not know who Malcolm was, or worse, he did not care enough to ask. He only saw a black man holding a towel near confidential financial documents. Richard pointed toward the door. "Out. This is a boardroom, not a hallway closet. People like you do not stand near private financing materials." A junior director smirked. The smell of spilled coffee still clung to the towel in Malcolm's hand. Expensive perfume floated from the board table. The overhead lights were sharp enough to make every chrome pen shine like a blade. A security camera above the glass door blinked red, recording everything. Malcolm did not raise his voice. He only looked at Richard and asked, "Are you certain you want me to leave this room before the credit meeting begins?" Richard leaned back in his chair. "If you understand English, then yes." No one defended Malcolm. Not the board members, not the legal advisor at the wall, not the assistant standing by the credenza with a tablet against her chest. Only Victoria Lane, the chief financial officer, looked up with doubt in her eyes. She had noticed the leather folder. She had noticed how Malcolm looked at the altered cash flow chart. She had noticed that when he asked one question about the debt schedule, every finance director in the room went quiet, but she said nothing. That silence would cost them. Within 20 minutes, Richard Calloway would learn that the man he called just the janitor was Malcolm Hayes, chief executive officer of Hayes Meridian Bank, the only person in the building with final authority over the $50 million credit line Sterling North needed to survive. And by the time Richard understood, the damage would already be sitting in the room with him, wearing a plain navy suit, holding proof, and remembering every word. That morning began at 10:21. Malcolm Hayes stepped out of the private elevator on floor 47 of Sterling North Tower 19 minutes earlier than scheduled. He preferred to arrive before polished greetings. He preferred to see how a company breathed before it knew it was being watched. A balance sheet could be prepared. A board packet could be revised. A slide deck could be made beautiful enough to hide panic. But a hallway told the truth by accident. The reception area outside the board suite had black marble floors, glass walls, and a view of Lake Erie under a hard winter sky. On one wall hung framed photographs of Sterling North factories, smiling workers in hard hats, and old newspaper clippings about American manufacturing excellence. Beneath those photographs, a young assistant named Nora stood beside a printer, breathing too fast while sorting binders labeled Project Harborline. Malcolm saw the way her fingers shook, not from cold, from fear. A finance director in a silver tie stood over her and hissed, "The tab order is wrong. If Richard sees covenant schedules before the liquidity bridge, he will skin us alive." Nora whispered, "I printed the order from the email, then read better emails." The director snatched the binder from her hand so hard that the plastic cover snapped. Malcolm slowed. The director saw him looking and straightened. "Can I help you?" Malcolm said. "I'm early for the credit meeting." The director looked at his suit, then at the visitor badge clipped low on his jacket. The badge had been printed at the lobby desk, but the ink had smeared slightly because the machine jammed. Only the first name was clear, Malcolm. The last name was blurred. The director gave him the quick downward glance powerful people give when they are deciding how little respect a person costs. "The boardroom is not ready. I can wait. Reception is down the hall." Then the director turned back to Nora as if Malcolm had already disappeared. Malcolm did not move at once. He looked at the cracked corner of Nora's tablet screen. He looked at the binders. He looked at the top sheet that had slid halfway free. Cash preservation plan, vendor deferral schedule, factory 2 safety reserve. The last phrase had been struck through in red. That was the first warning, not the insult, not yet. The numbers. Malcolm had learned long ago that people often revealed their character in what they crossed out. He walked toward the glass waiting area, but before he reached it, a sharp crash echoed from the hall near the service alcove. A metal bucket tipped over. Water spread across the black marble floor. A gray-haired janitor stumbled back, both hands raised as if apology had become reflex. A young executive in brown Italian shoes had clipped the bucket with his heel while looking at his phone. Coffee from his paper cup splashed across the floor, mixing with the water. The executive looked down at his shoe. "Are you serious, Samuel?" The janitor bent quickly. "I'm sorry, sir. You people always pick the worst place to clean." The executive stepped around the spill, leaving wet footprints across the marble. No apology, no pause, no concern that someone might slip. Samuel Reed, the janitor, lowered himself slowly with one hand braced against the wall. He was in his late 60s, with a stiff back, tired eyes, and a blue work shirt with a name patch that had been washed so many times the letters had faded. His hands shook as he reached for the fallen mop handle. Malcolm set down his leather folder on a bench. Then he crouched beside Samuel. "Let me help." Samuel looked startled. "Sir, you do not need to do that. If the floor is wet, anybody can fall." Samuel swallowed. Most people just step around it. Most people are too proud of the wrong things. Malcolm picked up the bucket, wrung out the mop, and took a white towel from Samuel's cart. Together they blocked the wet area before the water reached the elevator doors. A woman in a cream coat walked past them and lifted her shoes high, annoyed. Another director stepped around Malcolm without looking at his face. The security camera blinked above them. Samuel noticed Malcolm's hands. "You know how to wring a mop." Malcolm smiled faintly. "I paid for 2 years of school doing night cleaning in a finance building." Samuel looked at him differently then. "You did. I did." Before Samuel could ask more, the boardroom door opened down the hall. Laughter spilled out. Someone called for more coffee. The young executive with the brown shoes pointed toward Malcolm without truly seeing him. "You there? When you finish that, check the conference room. There is coffee under chair 8. Samuel stiffened. Malcolm looked toward the open door. "Chair 8, he said quietly. The executive was already walking away. Samuel reached for the towel. "I will get it." Malcolm held it back. "You handle the spill here. I'm going that way." Samuel shook his head. "They do not like us in there when the board documents are out. Us," the word stayed between them. Malcolm looked toward the glass room where $50 million waited on a screen. Then he picked up his leather folder and the towel. "I will be careful," Samuel said. "Sir, I do not even know your name." Malcolm looked back. "Malcolm." Samuel nodded. "Samuel Reed. Good to meet you, Mr. Reed." Samuel blinked at the title. People did not call him that often. Malcolm walked toward the boardroom. Inside, the conference room looked like a stage built for money. A long walnut table, 12 black leather chairs, pitch books stacked in perfect rows, water glasses filled to equal height, a silver tray of pastries no one had touched. At the center of the table lay 2 versions of the same document. One thick binder with Hayes Meridian Bank stamped on the cover, one slim board packet marked Executive Summary. Malcolm saw the difference immediately. The bank binder had the full risk schedule, the board packet did not. He stepped farther into the room, towel still in hand. A director near the window glanced up. "Finally, the coffee is under that chair." Malcolm looked beneath chair 8. There was a dark splash on the carpet and 3 drops on the polished floor. He crouched, wiped the floor so no one would step in it, then stood. His eyes moved to the open packet nearest him. Liquidity bridge. Adjusted earnings forecast. Supplier stabilization plan. He turned one page with 2 fingers. The safety reserve line was missing. So was the footnote about delayed overtime payments. So was the section about the labor complaint at Factory 2. Malcolm looked up. "Is this the final version for the credit discussion?" The room stilled. The director by the window frowned. "Excuse me." Malcolm pointed gently to the packet. "This version does not match the lender package delivered last Friday." A pen stopped clicking. Nora, still near the credenza, looked at Malcolm as if she had heard thunder inside a closed room. Richard Calloway entered from the private side door before anyone answered. He was tall, silver-haired, and dressed in a charcoal suit that looked more expensive than Samuel Carr. He carried himself like a man who had never been forced to wait in a public lobby. His cufflinks flashed when he adjusted his sleeve. His cologne reached the table before he did. "What is this?" No one answered. Richard looked at Malcolm, the towel, the plain suit, the smeared badge. His face hardened. "Who let this man in here?" The young executive with brown shoes said, "I think facilities sent him." A board member laughed under his breath. Richard's eyes moved to the open packet. "Were you reading that?" Malcolm said. "I asked whether it was the final version." Richard stared at him as if the sentence itself was offensive. The final version of what? The credit materials. The room went very quiet. Then the board member near the window smiled. Listen to him. The janitor is reviewing credit materials now. A few people laughed. Nora looked down. Victoria Lane, sitting 2 seats from Richard, did not laugh. Her fingers pressed together on the table. Richard stepped closer. "This is a confidential board meeting. It involves lender negotiations, cash flow projections, supplier exposure, and private company information. You do not belong in this room." Malcolm held Richard's gaze. "I understand confidentiality." Richard gave a cold smile. "Do you?" The sentence did not sound like a question. It sounded like a door closing. Malcolm set the towel on the side table, folded once. Then he picked up his leather folder. Richard saw the movement and snapped, "Leave the folder. It is mine." Richard's eyes narrowed. "What is in it?" "Documents for the meeting." "Yeah." The window director laughed again. "Which meeting?" "The mop rotation committee." More laughter. Polite, poisoned. Victoria looked at Nora. Nora looked like she wanted to disappear. Richard pointed to the glass door. "Out." Malcolm did not move. He asked, "Are you certain?" Richard leaned forward, each word sharp. "People like you do not get to stand in a room like this and question numbers you do not understand." The sentence landed. Even the people who had laughed stopped smiling for a second. Because there it was, not policy, not confidentiality. Something older, something uglier, dressed in corporate language. Malcolm's face did not change, only his hand tightened around the black folder. Inside that folder was the final credit authority memo for Hayes Meridian Bank. Inside was a clause Elaine Porter had marked in blue, governance conduct and material disclosure risk. Inside was the authority Richard assumed belonged to someone else. Malcolm said, "I will step out." Richard replied, "Good." Malcolm looked once at Victoria. She looked away. That was the mistake. He walked to the door. Nora stood frozen near the credenza, holding the cracked tablet against her chest. Samuel stood outside in the hall, seeing just enough through the glass to understand what had happened. His hand closed around the mop handle. Malcolm opened the boardroom door. Behind him, Richard said, "Security should make sure facilities workers are kept out of lender areas before the actual bank people arrive." A board member said, "Imagine if Hayes Meridian saw that." Another voice answered, "The bank only cares about getting paid." Malcolm paused in the doorway. He did not turn around. He only looked up at the red blinking camera above the glass. Then he left. The door closed behind him with a soft click. Too soft for what had just happened. In the hallway, Samuel stepped toward him. "Mr. Malcolm." Malcolm raised one hand gently. "I'm all right." Samuel's eyes were wet with anger. "They talk like that all the time." Malcolm looked down the hall. "Do they?" Samuel nodded. Not always that bold, but close. Malcolm breathed in once. He could feel an old memory waking. Night floors, cold offices, men in suits stepping around him as if he were equipment. A younger version of himself wiping fingerprints from a conference table where executives talked about numbers bigger than anything his family had ever held. One man had said, "Boys like that do not need to understand finance. They just need to keep the room clean." Malcolm had said nothing then. He had gone home at 3 in the morning, opened a used accounting textbook at his kitchen table, and studied until sunrise. His mother had found him asleep over the pages. She had touched his shoulder and said, "Do not let their blindness become your mirror." He had carried that sentence for 30 years. Now, on floor 47 of Sterling North Tower, with a wet towel smell still on his sleeve and $50 million waiting behind glass, that sentence returned. "Do not let their blindness become your mirror," Samuel asked. "Should I call security?" "No. Are you leaving?" "Not the building." Malcolm looked toward the elevator. "Elaine Porter should be here soon." Samuel wiped his hands on his uniform. "Who is Elaine?" "My general counsel." Samuel blinked. "Your what?" Before Malcolm could answer, the elevator opened. Elaine Porter stepped out with two Hayes Meridian analysts behind her. She was a lean woman in a black coat, carrying a locked document case and walking with the calm of someone who expected rooms to rearrange themselves around facts. She saw Malcolm in the hall, then she saw Samuel, then she saw the towel on Malcolm's sleeve, then she saw the boardroom door. Her expression changed. "What happened?" Malcolm said. "We arrived early enough to see the culture." Elaine looked through the glass wall. Inside, Richard was laughing with two directors near the head of the table. Victoria sat still, staring at the visitor log on the tablet Nora had finally brought to her. The visitor log showed one entry at 10:21, Malcolm Hayes, Hayes Meridian Bank, Final Credit Authority. Victoria's face had gone pale. Nora whispered something to her. Victoria looked toward the glass door. Her eyes met Malcolm through the wall. Everything stopped. Elaine lowered her voice. "Do you want to proceed?" Malcolm looked at the screen inside the boardroom. Final credit line approval, $50 million. Then he looked at Samuel Reed, still holding the mop handle like a man who had spent years being told to remain invisible. Malcolm opened his leather folder. "We proceed, but not with the meeting they prepared." Elaine nodded once. Inside the boardroom, Richard checked his watch. The official meeting was about to begin. He straightened his jacket. He smiled at the door. He still believed the bank people were coming to save him. He had no idea the man he had just thrown out was the only one who could. Malcolm Hayes stood in the hallway outside the boardroom, not moving toward the elevator, not raising his voice, not letting the old wound inside him choose the next sentence. That was the part people never understood about calm. Calm was not weakness. Calm was work. Elaine Porter stood beside him with the locked document case in her hand. Two credit analysts from Hayes Meridian Bank waited behind her, both young, both silent, both beginning to understand that the meeting had changed before it started. Samuel Reed still held the mop handle near the service alcove. The spilled coffee was gone now, but the smell remained in the hallway, bitter and faint beneath the lemon cleaner. Samuel looked at Malcolm like a man trying to place a face inside a world that had never made room for him. "You are the bank," Samuel said quietly. Malcolm looked at him. "I work for the bank." Samuel shook his head. "No, sir. They were waiting for you." Malcolm did not deny it. The elevator doors closed behind Elaine's team with a soft metallic sigh. Inside the boardroom, Richard Calloway laughed again, though the sound had changed. It was not the easy laugh of a man in control anymore. It was a man laughing because silence would make him hear his own mistake. Through the glass wall, Malcolm saw Victoria Lane sitting very still. Her tablet was flat on the table. The visitor log was open. Malcolm Hayes, Hayes Meridian Bank, Final Credit Authority. Her eyes moved from the tablet to Malcolm, then to Richard, then to the altered executive summary at the center of the table. She knew. Or at least, she knew enough to be afraid. That was another thing Malcolm had learned in finance. Fear often reached the truth before courage did. Elaine lowered her voice. "We can delay and request a formal governance review before entering." Malcolm looked through the glass at Richard. "No?" Elaine waited. Malcolm said, "If we delay, they will clean the room. They will revise the packet. They will coach the witnesses. They will turn what happened into confusion." One analyst swallowed. Malcolm continued, "We enter while the truth is still warm." Elaine nodded. "Then we need the record clean." "It is clean," Malcolm said. He looked up at the red blinking camera over the conference room door. "Video." Elaine followed his eyes. "Security camera, hallway and boardroom entrance, possibly audio in the lobby depending on building policy." Samuel spoke before he could stop himself. "Boardroom has meeting capture too." Elaine turned to him. Samuel shifted, suddenly unsure. "They record some executive meetings. Not all, but when the big screen is on, the ceiling microphones usually blink green. I clean around them. I see what lights up." Malcolm looked at Samuel. "That matters." Samuel lowered his gaze. "I just notice things. People who are ignored notice everything," Malcolm said. Samuel looked up again. For a second, the hallway did not feel like a hallway. It felt like a witness stand. Elaine opened her case and removed a slim blue folder. On the tab were the words, "Sterling North Credit Line, Governance Conditions." She handed it to Malcolm. "Before we enter," she said, "I want you aware of Clause 12.4 and Clause 14.2. Malcolm took the folder. He already knew the clauses, but he listened because good leaders did not punish preparation by pretending they needed none. Elaine said, Clause 12.4 allows withdrawal before funding if there is material misrepresentation, omission, or presentation of lender materials inconsistent with the diligence record. Malcolm nodded. Clause 14.2 allows suspension for governance conduct that creates reputational or operational risk, especially if management treatment of employees suggests retaliation, concealment, or unsafe reporting channels. One of the analysts whispered, "That is unusual language." Elaine looked at him. Malcolm added it after the Wexler Foods collapse. The analyst knew the case. Everyone in commercial credit knew it. Wexler Foods had looked profitable for 9 months after it was already hollow. Executives had hidden safety complaints, delayed vendor payments, and threatened plant workers who reported spoiled storage conditions. Hayes Meridian had not been the lead lender, but Malcolm had studied the wreckage. He had learned that cash flow could lie when employees were too frightened to tell the truth. After that, he had changed the way his bank looked at risk. Not only numbers, culture. Not only assets, conduct, not only what executives said under lights. What workers whispered in halls. Sterling North had not understood that. Richard especially had not understood that. Inside the boardroom, a director adjusted his cufflinks and said something that made 2 others smile. Victoria did not smile. She picked up her phone under the table and typed quickly. Malcolm saw the subject line before she lowered the screen. Need accurate packet now. That was the second warning. Somewhere in the building, a file existed that Richard did not want in the room. Malcolm turned slightly toward Samuel. "Mr. Reed, how long have you worked in this building?" 18 years. At Sterling North. Yes, sir. Through the building contractor first, then direct, then back through a contractor again when they changed budgets. Do they treat your team differently when outside visitors come? Samuel gave a tired smile. They remember we exist when they want us hidden. Elaine wrote that down. Samuel glanced at her pen. Is this going to get me fired? Malcolm answered before Elaine could. Not by me. That is not the same as no. No, Malcolm said. It is not. He respected the truth enough not to soften it. Samuel looked toward the boardroom. My wife is sick. I need this job. Malcolm nodded. Then I will not ask you to speak before you choose to. But I will say this. A company asking for $50 million to protect jobs should not make the quietest worker afraid to tell the truth about how the building runs. Samuel held the mop handle tighter. Down the hall, the service elevator opened. A woman in a dark green coat stepped out carrying a worn canvas bag and a folder thick with papers. Security followed 2 steps behind her. The woman was Maya Thompson. Malcolm recognized her from the lobby. He had seen her 20 minutes earlier near the security desk, arguing with a guard who kept saying the board floor was restricted. She had worn a visitor badge printed in red instead of blue. Union representative. Temporary access. Awaiting approval. Now she was on the 47th floor, but not because the board had welcomed her. Nora, the assistant, had brought her up. Nora walked beside Maya, pale but determined, cracked tablet held against her chest. Richard will be furious, Nora whispered. Maya said, Richard has been furious for years. It has not repaired one guardrail at Factory 2. The security guard stopped when he saw Malcolm and Elaine. Ma'am, I was told she cannot enter the board suite without authorization. Elaine stepped forward. I am Elaine Porter, General Counsel for Hayes Meridian Bank. The lender requests that Ms. Thompson remain available as a potential labor risk witness for the Sterling North Credit Review. The guard blinked. He had been trained to obey Sterling North badges. He had not been trained for lender counsel using witness language. Maya looked at Malcolm. You are with Hayes Meridian. Malcolm said, Yes. Then you should know they are not telling you everything. Elaine opened her blue folder. We are beginning to understand that. Maya looked toward the boardroom. They delayed overtime payments at Factory 2 twice. They moved safety repair costs out of the main cash bridge. They told supervisors to keep complaints verbal so nothing would show up in the diligence room. Nora whispered, Maya. Maya glanced at the assistant. I am done whispering. That sentence did not fill the hallway loudly. It filled it completely. Malcolm looked at Nora. You brought her up. Nora nodded once, barely. Why? Nora looked through the glass at Richard. Because I printed 2 packets last night, the one for the bank and the one for the board. They were not the same. Her eyes filled, but she did not cry. I asked which one was correct. They told me the correct one was the one that kept the meeting alive. Elaine wrote faster now. Malcolm said, Who told you that? Nora looked at the floor. Finance Director Bryce Kellen. Then Mr. Calloway approved the board version at 9:42 this morning. Elaine asked, "Was there an email?" Nora nodded. Subject line: packet cleanup before Hayes Meridian arrival. Everything in the hallway seemed to stop. There it was. Not only culture, not only insult, not only one arrogant chairman calling a man a janitor. Evidence, a subject line, a timestamp, a name, a choice. Malcolm felt the old sadness more than anger. It was always strange how people destroyed themselves with small sentences they believed would never be read by the right eyes. Inside the boardroom, Richard checked his watch again. He was still waiting for the rescue. Malcolm looked at Nora. "Do you still have that email? On my tablet?" "Do not forward it yet," Elaine said. "Preserve it. Do not edit, do not screenshot, do not delete. We may need information technology to capture metadata." Nora nodded quickly. Maya looked at Malcolm more closely. "You are Malcolm Hayes." Samuel looked at her. "You know him." Maya said, "Every worker representative knows the lender who made governance conduct part of credit review." It made half the old executives in this city nervous. Malcolm almost smiled. Only half. Maya did not smile back. The other half learned how to fake respect when lenders visit. That line stayed with him, because it was exactly why he arrived early. Sterling North Industries had once been the pride of Cleveland manufacturing. Its equipment was inside hospitals, water treatment plants, shipping centers, and public infrastructure projects across 4 states. The company employed just under 3,000 workers across facilities in Cleveland, Toledo, and Youngstown. Its board packet called those workers human capital. Maya called them people. The $50 million credit line was supposed to stabilize working capital after 2 bad quarters, delayed government receivables, higher steel costs, and a canceled export contract. On paper, the loan was useful, maybe even necessary. But the numbers Malcolm saw before the meeting had already been fragile. Accounts payable stretched beyond 60 days. Payroll timing supported by temporary vendor deferrals, a liquidity bridge depending on an optimistic collection schedule. Factory 2 safety reserve moved from current quarter to later review. Those problems were serious, but not always fatal. Honest companies could survive serious problems. Dishonest leadership turned serious problems into traps. Malcolm had seen it before. That was why he looked at hallways. His father had been a night security guard in Columbus. His mother worked laundry at St. Agnes Hospital. Malcolm had grown up in a small apartment where the kitchen table served as desk, dinner table, ironing board, and bill negotiation center. He had earned scholarships, but scholarships did not cover every meal or textbook or bus pass, so he cleaned offices at night. At 19, he wore gray work pants and carried a ring of keys through a downtown finance building after midnight. He emptied trash cans under framed degrees. He vacuumed boardrooms where men discussed acquisitions. He wiped coffee rings from tables where people made decisions about workers they had never met. Most nights, no one saw him. Some nights, they did. That was worse. Once, while he cleaned a conference table, a vice president left his meeting notes behind. Malcolm glanced at a formula written in the margin because he had been studying discounted cash flows. The man saw him looking. "Those numbers are not for you," the vice president said. Malcolm apologized. The man laughed. "People like you keep the room clean. People like us decide what happens in it." Malcolm had gone home that night with his hands smelling of bleach and his chest burning. His mother found him at 3 a.m. bent over a used finance textbook, lips moving as he worked through formulas. She did not tell him to sleep. She placed a chipped mug of tea beside him and said the sentence that became the hinge of his life: "Do not let their blindness become your mirror." He never did. Years later, when he became the youngest partner at Meridian Capital, he kept a janitor key on his desk. Not the original. That one had been lost. But a plain brass key his father gave him before he died. A reminder: every room has a door. Every door can teach you who believes you belong. That morning at Sterling North, Richard Calloway had taught him quickly, but Malcolm had not built a career on personal offense. He did not cancel credit because he was insulted. He canceled when insult revealed risk, and Sterling North was beginning to reveal more than Richard knew. Elaine closed her folder. "We need to enter now," she said. "The longer we wait, the more likely they shift documents." Malcolm turned to Maya. "Will you remain available?" Maya gripped her canvas bag. "I have copies of worker statements, unpaid overtime complaints, and 2 photographs from the cracked press shield at Factory 2. But I will not let them use workers as a prop to get money and then punish them after you leave." "Good," Malcolm said. She blinked. "Good. If this room wants credit, it will have to learn that the workers are not props. Nora looked toward the boardroom. What should I do? Malcolm said. Tell the truth when asked. Not before, not after, when asked. Nora nodded. Samuel looked down at his uniform. And me. Malcolm softened. You have already done more than you know. No, Samuel said. His voice was quiet but firmer. If they talk about people like me while I'm outside the door, I want to be close enough to hear it. Malcolm looked at him for a long second. Then stay. Samuel stood a little straighter. Inside the boardroom, Richard finally noticed Elaine outside the glass. He smiled wide and walked toward the door with both hands open. There she is, he said before opening it. Hayes Meridian has arrived. He pulled the door open. Elaine stepped in first. Malcolm did not follow immediately. He let Richard greet her. Richard said, Ms. Porter, welcome. We are ready to finalize. Our team has prepared the cleanest possible materials for your approval. Elaine looked at the table. I'm sure you have. The edge in her voice passed over Richard without landing. He was still smiling. Please come in. We were just waiting for Mr. Hayes. Elaine placed her locked case on the table. Yes, she said. So were we. Richard laughed. I assume he is on his way up. Elaine turned toward the glass door. He is already here. Malcolm stepped into the doorway. The room changed before anyone spoke. A pen rolled from a director's hand and clicked against a water glass. Nora, still in the hallway, shut her eyes. Victoria Lane lowered her head as if a verdict had entered on quiet feet. Richard stared. For one wild second, his face tried to rearrange the truth into something survivable. The towel, the folder, the question. Are you certain you want me to leave this room before the credit meeting begins? Malcolm walked to the head of the table reserved for Hayes Meridian Bank. He placed the black leather folder in front of the chair, but did not sit yet. Elaine's voice was clear. For the record, this is Malcolm Hayes, Chief Executive Officer of Hayes Meridian Bank and final credit authority for the Sterling North Industries $50 million senior secured revolving credit line. No one laughed now. The cold blue screen still read, Final Credit Line Approval. $50 million. Richard's mouth opened, but no words came. Malcolm looked at him. 20 minutes ago, you asked me to leave this room. Richard swallowed. Mr. Hayes, there appears to have been a misunderstanding. Malcolm nodded once. There was. Richard exhaled too early. Then Malcolm said, You misunderstood the value of the man you thought I was. The sentence did not land loudly. It landed cleanly. That was worse. Richard Calloway stood at the head of the boardroom table with one hand still half lifted, as if he had planned to welcome a different man and could not make his body accept the one in front of him. Malcolm Hayes did not sit yet. He stood beside the chair reserved for Hayes Meridian Bank, the same chair Richard had been preparing to charm, flatter, and rush toward signature. The cold blue screen behind him still read, Final Credit Line Approval. $50 million. The words looked different now, not like a promise, like evidence. Elaine Porter placed her locked document case on the table and opened it with a soft click. The sound was small, but every person in the room heard it. Victoria Lane stared at the leather folder in Malcolm's hand. Nora, the assistant, stood outside the glass door with her cracked tablet pressed to her chest. Samuel Reed stood a few steps behind her in his blue janitor shirt, holding the mop handle as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. Maya Thompson waited near the hall with her canvas bag full of worker statements. The people Sterling North had kept outside the room were suddenly closer to the truth than the people sitting in leather chairs. Richard forced a smile. Mr. Hayes, I owe you an apology for the confusion. We have strict confidentiality policies around lender materials, and when someone entered carrying a cleaning towel, my team responded to protect private documents. Malcolm looked at the folded towel on the side table. The room followed his eyes. Coffee still stained one corner. Protect private documents, Malcolm repeated. Yes, Richard said quickly. That is all this was. No, Richard stopped. Malcolm finally sat. He opened the black leather folder with the initials M.H. pressed into the corner. He removed one page and placed it in front of him, straightening it with 2 fingers. That was not all it was. A director near the window shifted in his chair. Perhaps we should begin fresh, he said. This is a critical financing discussion. Malcolm looked at him. It became a critical financing discussion the moment your chairman told someone he believed was a janitor that people like you do not stand near documents you do not understand. No one moved. Richard's face tightened. I did not mean it in that way. Malcolm looked around the room. Which way did you mean it? The question sat there. There was no safe answer. Victoria lowered her eyes. She had heard the words. So had everyone else. So had the camera. Elaine slid a blue folder across the table to Malcolm. He didn't open it yet. Richard adjusted his cufflinks, buying seconds. Mr. Hayes, Sterling North has worked for months on this credit line. We employ nearly 3,000 people. Our suppliers are depending on us. Our factories are depending on us. I would hate for an unfortunate first impression to distract from the real matter. Malcolm leaned back slightly. The real matter is trust. Richard nodded too fast. Exactly, and we trust Hayes Meridian. That is not what I said. Richard's mouth closed. Malcolm opened the first binder. This is the lender diligence package Sterling North delivered to Hayes Meridian last Friday at 4:16 in the afternoon. The file name was Sterling North, Project Harbor Line Full Risk Schedule. He opened the slim packet from the table. This is the executive summary placed before your board this morning. He turned one page, then another, then another. The paper sounded loud in the silence. Malcolm said, in the lender package, page 42 includes a reserve line for Factory 2 safety repairs. In the board summary, that line is missing. Victoria's eyes flickered. Richard did not look at her. Malcolm continued. In the lender package, Appendix C includes delayed overtime payments pending reconciliation at Cleveland and Youngstown facilities. In the board summary, that language is reduced to payroll timing adjustment. A finance director named Bryce Kellen went pale. Malcolm turned another page. In the lender package, there is a labor risk note about potential work stoppage if safety complaints remain unresolved. In the board version, that section is gone. Richard said, executive summaries are summaries. They do not include every detail. Malcolm nodded once. True. Then his eyes lifted. But when every omitted detail makes the company look safer than it is, the summary becomes concealment. Everything froze. Elaine opened her folder. For the record, Hayes Meridian Bank Credit Condition 12.4 allows withdrawal before funding. If Sterling North provides materially inconsistent presentations of risk between diligence materials, board materials, and lender representations. Richard turned toward her. Ms. Porter, with respect, no funds have moved yet. This is precisely why we are here, to discuss final questions. Elaine looked at him without expression. Yes, and now we are discussing them. Malcolm turned to Victoria. Ms. Lane, are you aware of two different versions of the credit packet being prepared for today? Victoria's hands were folded so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Richard said, Victoria does not need to answer that. We are not in a deposition. Elaine spoke calmly. No one said we were. But if Sterling North wants Hayes Meridian to continue this meeting, the bank is allowed to ask whether the chief financial officer can verify the integrity of the materials. Victoria did not look at Richard. She looked at Malcolm. There were internal revisions. Richard leaned forward. Victoria. She stopped. The name sounded like a warning. Malcolm heard it. So did Elaine. So did Nora outside the glass. Malcolm said, Ms. Lane, before you answer, understand this. Silence is also information. It tells a lender who holds power in this room and who fears using the truth. Victoria closed her eyes. For a second, she looked less like a chief financial officer and more like someone standing on the edge of a bridge. Then she opened them. There were revisions made last night. Richard slammed one palm on the table. Enough. The sharp sound made Nora flinch outside the room. Samuel saw it. Malcolm saw Samuel see it. That was how culture worked. It taught fear so deeply that people reacted before danger even touched them. Malcolm did not raise his voice. Richard, sit down. Richard stared at him. This is my boardroom. No, Malcolm said. This is a credit review, and right now, you are making the review worse. The room went silent again. Richard slowly sat. Elaine turned to the glass door. Ms. Shaw, please come in. Nora looked startled. Me? Yes, Richard snapped. She is an assistant, Malcolm answered. She is also the person who printed the materials. Nora entered like the floor might punish her. Her cracked tablet was still against her chest. She stood near the wall, not at the table. Malcolm looked at her gently. Ms. Shaw, did you print more than one version of today's credit packet? Nora looked at Richard. Her lips parted, but nothing came out. Richard's voice turned soft in a way that sounded more dangerous than shouting. Nora, be careful. Malcolm said. She will be, Elaine added. Hayes Meridian requests preservation of all emails, document versions, metadata, print logs, and meeting recordings related to Project Harbor Line from the last 72 hours. Bryce Kellen whispered something under his breath. Elaine looked at him. Mr. Kellen, do not delete anything. His face drained. Nora held up the tablet. There was an email this morning at 9:42, subject line, packet cleanup before Hayes Meridian arrival. Richard closed his eyes for 1 second. Nora continued. Mr. Kellen sent the revised print file. Mr. Calloway replied, use the cleaner version. Lenders do not need factory noise in the room. Maya Thompson, still outside the door, heard the phrase, factory noise. Her face hardened. Malcolm looked at Richard. Factory noise. Richard said, that was shorthand. It meant operational detail not relevant to credit approval. Malcolm leaned forward. 3,000 workers are not noise. No one answered. Malcolm turned to Elaine. Bring in Ms. Thompson. Richard stood again. Absolutely not. Malcolm looked at him. You're asking my bank to provide $50 million to stabilize payroll, suppliers, and plant operations. A worker representative alleging safety delays and wage timing problems is directly relevant, Richard said. She represents organized labor. She has an agenda. Malcolm said, so do you. That stopped him. Elaine opened the door. Maya Thompson entered the boardroom carrying her canvas bag and a folder thick with papers. She wore a dark green coat damp at the hem from the snow outside. Her hair was pulled back. Her face had the calm of someone who had already been dismissed by powerful men and had survived the experience. She didn't sit until Malcolm asked her to. Ms. Thompson, he said, what did Sterling North remove from the story it is telling this room? Maya placed her folder on the table. Factory 2 in Youngstown has had 3 safety complaints in 6 weeks related to a cracked press shield and delayed lockout maintenance. 2 supervisors told workers the repair was postponed until after financing closed. Bryce said, that is not accurate. Maya opened the folder and slid forward a photograph. Cracked shield, date stamp, January 8th, another photograph. Temporary warning tag removed before inspection walkthrough. Another, text message from a shift supervisor. Keep this verbal until the lender meeting clears. Victoria looked at the table as if the photographs were stones placed on a grave. Maya continued. Overtime payments were delayed in 2 payroll cycles. Workers were told it was an administrative timing issue. Then vendor deliveries were slowed because smaller suppliers were being stretched past 60 days. Richard's voice sharpened. You are presenting one side. Maya looked at him. It is the side that builds your products. The boardroom held its breath. Malcolm watched Richard not as an enemy, but as a risk profile becoming human. An arrogant chairman could recover from a bad sentence. A chairman who hid worker risk, threatened silence, and treated people as furniture could destroy a company from inside the walls. Malcolm turned toward the hallway. Mr. Reed. Samuel did not move. For years, people had called him when something spilled, not when something mattered. Malcolm said, please come in, if you choose to. Samuel stepped into the doorway. Richard looked offended all over again. Now we are hearing from cleaning staff. Malcolm looked at him. You keep proving why we need to. Samuel entered slowly. He kept his hands clasped in front of him. His name patch looked faded under the boardroom lights. Malcolm said, Mr. Reed, you told me you have worked in this building for 18 years. Yes, sir. What have you seen recently? Samuel glanced at Richard, then at the directors, then at Nora. Nora gave him the smallest nod. Samuel took a breath. People stay late and cry in the hallway. Finance people throw away draft pages after midnight. Factory workers call the front desk because no one answers their emails. Assistants whisper before they go into this room. Security gets lists of names not to let upstairs. Sometimes those names are workers, sometimes vendors. Richard said, this is anecdotal. Samuel nodded. Yes, sir. Floors are anecdotal too until someone slips. No one laughed. Samuel's voice grew steadier. I do not know your ratios. I do not know your bank language. I clean the rooms after you leave. But I know when people are afraid of telling the truth because they look over their shoulders even when they are alone. Malcolm said nothing. Because the room needed to hear Samuel without rescue. Samuel looked toward the long table. And I know this. When people are afraid in a building, the floor gets cold, even if the heat is working. The sentence reached places no spreadsheet could. Victoria Lane covered her mouth. Nora looked down at her tablet and cried silently. Bryce Kellen stared at the table. Richard looked furious because he was beginning to understand that the people he had considered background were now becoming records. Malcolm opened the Hayes Meridian binder again. He placed one finger on the clause Elaine had marked. Governance conduct, material disclosure, labor risk. He turned to the board. This bank does not lend only against receivables, inventory, and plant equipment. We lend against the likelihood that management will tell the truth when the truth is inconvenient. Richard said, "We have always met our obligations." Malcolm turned a page. "Your accounts payable aging says otherwise." Richard's jaw tightened. Malcolm continued. "Your revised board packet says otherwise. Your assistant says otherwise. Your labor representative says otherwise. Your janitor says otherwise." Samuel looked at him. Malcolm corrected himself. "Mr. Reed says otherwise." Samuel's eyes filled. That correction mattered. In that room, it mattered more than any title. Richard reached for a glass of water and missed it slightly. The rim clicked against his ring. He said, "Mr. Hayes, let us speak privately." "No." The word was quiet. Final. Richard stared. Malcolm said, "The mistake was made publicly. The risk was exposed publicly. The correction will not be hidden privately." A director near the far end finally spoke. "What exactly are you implying for the credit line?" Elaine answered, "Hayes Meridian has the right to suspend or withdraw final approval pending review." The director swallowed. "But not the obligation." "No," Elaine said, "the right." All eyes moved to Malcolm. The $50 million sat between them like a patient on an operating table. Not dead. Not safe. Richard saw the shift and tried one more time. "Malcolm, may I call you Malcolm?" "No." Richard blinked. "Mr. Hayes," he said, "we all regret the earlier misunderstanding, but if you pull this line, you risk harming the very workers you claim to respect." Maya stared at him. Samuel looked at the floor. Victoria closed her eyes. Malcolm leaned forward. "Do not use the workers as a shield after using them as a cost." Richard's face flushed. "That is not what I am doing. It is exactly what you are doing. You call them headcount when you cut safety. You call them labor drag when they ask for overtime. You call them factory noise when they threaten the story you want lenders to hear. But now, when your financing is at risk, you call them the people I might hurt." Everything froze. Richard had no answer. No, because the room knew. Malcolm looked toward Victoria. "Ms. Lane, I'm going to ask you once. Does the board packet in front of us provide a complete and fair presentation of the risk Sterling North asked Hayes Meridian to finance?" Richard said, "Victoria, I am warning you." Victoria stood. Her chair moved back with a low scrape. For the first time that morning, she did not look at Richard before speaking. "No." The word was small. Then it grew. "No, it does not." Richard whispered, "Sit down." She did not. The board packet minimized vendor delays, softened payroll timing issues, removed the Factory 2 safety reserve, and omitted the labor risk language. "I objected to the removal of 2 sections last night. I did not stop it." Her voice broke on the last sentence. "I should have." Nora wiped her face. Maya looked at Victoria with guarded surprise. Samuel looked at her too, not forgiving, seeing. Malcolm nodded once. "Thank you for telling the truth," Victoria said. "I told it too late." "Yes," Malcolm said. "But not never." The words echoed something his mother might have said. Richard stood so quickly his chair hit the wall behind him. "This is a staged ambush. You come in here, pretend to be staff, provoke a misunderstanding, parade in a janitor and a union representative, and now threaten to destroy a company over optics." Malcolm rose slowly. The room seemed to shrink around him. "I didn't pretend to be staff. I helped a man clean a spill after one of your executives knocked over his bucket and walked away." He stepped closer to the table. "I didn't provoke your words. I asked if you were certain." He placed one hand on the Hayes Meridian binder. "I did not parade in Mr. Reed or Ms. Thompson. I listened to the people your packet tried to erase." Then he looked directly at Richard. "And I'm not threatening to destroy your company. I'm deciding whether my bank should trust the people already doing that work from the inside." Richard breathed hard through his nose. Elaine placed a formal notice page on the table. The paper was crisp, too white, too clean. At the top, the Hayes Meridian Bank letterhead looked almost cold. Malcolm did not touch it yet. He looked around the room, one face at a time. Richard, Victoria, Bryce, the silent directors, Nora by the wall, Maya with her folder, Samuel in his faded blue shirt. Then he said, "Before I make the decision, everyone in this room should understand what is being weighed." He pointed to the screen. $50 million can keep a company alive. Then he pointed toward Samuel. But if the people running that company cannot recognize the dignity of a man holding a mop, I cannot trust them to protect 3,000 workers whose names never appear on the first slide. No one spoke. No one moved. The red light on the ceiling microphone blinked above them. Recording. Malcolm looked at Elaine, read the conditions. Elaine Porter lifted the formal notice from the table. The paper made a faint sound as it moved. In that room, even paper had become louder than Richard Calloway. Elaine stood beside Malcolm's chair, straight-backed, calm, and precise. She did not look angry. That made her more dangerous. Anger could be dismissed as emotion. Precision could not. She read from the document. Hayes Meridian Bank reserves the right to suspend final approval of the Sterling North Industries senior secured revolving credit line before funding, if material misrepresentation, omitted risk disclosure, governance instability, labor risk concealment, or management conduct creates a change in lender confidence. Richard gripped the edge of the table. "This is absurd." Elaine continued as if he had not spoken. Condition 1. Sterling North must provide complete and consistent financial materials across board, lender, and audit records. She turned one page. Condition 2. Sterling North must disclose all known labor disputes, delayed wage obligations, vendor payment deferrals, safety reserve changes, and operational disruptions that may affect liquidity, repayment capacity, or business continuity. Bryce Kellen, the finance director, stared down at his hands. Elaine's voice remained steady. Condition 3. Sterling North must preserve all emails, messages, document versions, print logs, meeting recordings, and metadata related to Project Harbor Line from the past 72 hours. Nora Shaw held her cracked tablet tighter. Condition 4. Hayes Meridian may withdraw final approval before funding if management behavior demonstrates a governance culture inconsistent with the borrower representations made during diligence. She placed the paper down. Then Malcolm spoke. "That condition is now active." The boardroom went still. Richard let out a short breath that might have been a laugh if fear had not broken it. "Active." Malcolm nodded. "Yes. You are seriously saying one uncomfortable exchange gives you the right to freeze $50 million? "No," Malcolm said. "I'm saying the exchange revealed the room. The altered packet confirmed the room. The email preserved the room. The witness statements explain the room. Your reaction keeps proving the room." Richard looked around at the board, searching for rescue. None came quickly enough. Malcolm opened the lender binder and turned to the disclosure schedule. The bank received one version of the risk profile. Your board received another. Your finance director removed safety and labor details from the summary. Your chairman approved cleaner materials after being told the details were messy. Your assistant can identify the email. Your chief financial officer has confirmed that the board packet is not complete. Your labor representative has provided worker statements and photographs from Factory 2. Mr. Reed has described a culture where people are afraid to tell the truth. He looked directly at Richard. "This is not an optics problem." Richard's jaw tightened. "Then what is it? A trust failure?" No one spoke. The words settled over the polished table, over the untouched pastries, over the expensive pens, over the cold blue screen that still displayed the money they had expected to receive. Victoria Lane stood near the far side of the table. She had spent years presenting numbers in rooms where Richard already knew what answer he wanted. She had learned when to pause, when to soften language, when to move hard truths into later pages. She had told herself she was protecting the company, protecting jobs, protecting time. But fear had its own accounting. It charged interest. And now the bill had arrived. Richard turned toward her. "Victoria, explain the packet process properly." She looked at him. Properly. The word seemed to exhaust her. Richard's voice hardened. "Now." Victoria took a breath. The packet process was not proper. Several board members looked at her sharply. She continued before courage could leave. The bank received a fuller diligence package last Friday because compliance required it. The board version was shortened last night. I objected to removing the Factory 2 safety reserve and the delayed overtime note. Bryce said the board needed the confidence story. Richard approved that phrase. Bryce said, "Victoria, that is not fair." She turned to him. No. What was not fair was asking Nora to print 2 versions and then leaving her to stand by the wall like she did something wrong. Nora covered her mouth. Victoria faced Malcolm. "I knew the company needed the credit line. I thought if we lost it, 3,000 workers would be in danger. I told myself that keeping the meeting alive was better than bringing every risk into the room." Her voice cracked. But the risks were already in the room. We were the ones refusing to name them. Maya Thompson watched her carefully, not forgiving, not attacking, listening. Richard slammed his palm on the table. "This is panic. That is all this is. A chief financial officer losing her nerve at the worst possible moment." Malcolm turned to Richard. "No, this is the first financially responsible sentence she has spoken in this meeting." Richard stared at him. Malcolm looked at the independent directors. "Your chairman is asking this bank to fund a company whose internal truth had to be smuggled into the room by an assistant, a worker representative, and a janitor." Samuel Reed lowered his eyes at the word janitor, not because Malcolm had insulted him, but because everyone else now heard the word differently. Malcolm corrected gently, "By Mr. Reed." Samuel looked up. That simple correction moved through the room like a hand placing a name back where a label had been. Elaine passed copies of the formal notice to each board member. "Hayes Meridian Bank is suspending and withdrawing final approval for the $50 million credit line effective immediately, pending further review." Richard pushed back from the table. "You cannot do that," Elaine said. "We can. You will destroy us." Malcolm replied, "No, we will not finance destruction dressed as rescue." Richard pointed at Malcolm. "You are punishing a company because I mistook you for cleaning staff." The old arrogance returned because fear had nowhere else to go. Malcolm stood. "Richard, I would not punish a company because you mistook me for a janitor." He let the sentence breathe. Then he continued, "Being mistaken for someone who works hard is not an insult. The insult is that you believed a janitor deserved less dignity, less patience, less truth, and less voice." Samuel swallowed. Maya looked down. Victoria wiped one tear quickly and stood straighter. Malcolm's voice lowered. "If you cannot recognize the dignity of a man holding a mop, I cannot trust you to protect 3,000 workers whose names are buried beneath the word headcount." Richard looked around the table again. This time, something had changed. The board members who had laughed 20 minutes earlier were no longer looking at Malcolm. They were looking at themselves. One of them, an older independent director named Helen Marsh, pushed her packet away. "I want the meeting recording preserved." Richard turned. "Helen." She did not look at him. "I also want outside counsel engaged before close of business." Another director said, "We should review the email chain first." Elaine answered, "You should preserve it first." Helen nodded. "Preserve everything, then review." Richard's face darkened. "You are letting the lender dictate our board process." Helen finally looked at him. "No. You let your conduct invite lender scrutiny into it." That sentence shifted the room. Authority began moving away from Richard. Not dramatically, not with shouting, with chairs turning, with eyes no longer seeking his permission, with silence no longer obeying him. Bryce Kellen spoke weakly. "I was following direction." Malcolm looked at him. "That may explain your conduct. It does not excuse it." Bryce lowered his head. Nora, still near the wall, lifted the tablet. "I can show the email." Elaine raised one hand. "Not on this screen, not yet. Sterling North Information Technology and outside counsel should preserve the device image properly. Do not let anyone take that tablet from you without a written chain of custody." Nora looked frightened. "Can I keep it with me?" Helen answered before Richard could. "Yes," Richard snapped. "She is an assistant." Helen turned cold. "She is a witness." Nora almost cried again. This time she did not lower her head. Maya opened her folder. "If there is an outside review, workers need protection from retaliation, written protection, not a memo that can disappear." Victoria nodded. "She is right," Richard scoffed. "Of course she is right now. Everyone is suddenly brave while someone else holds the gun to the company head." Malcolm did not flinch. "No one here is holding a gun. We are holding your own documents." The line struck harder than anger. Elaine wrote something on her pad. Helen looked at the other board members. I move that the board convene an emergency governance session immediately after this meeting. Richard Callaway will recuse himself from any discussion related to Project Harborline, labor disclosure, Factory 2 safety reporting, and the Hayes Meridian credit suspension. Richard stood. You do not have the votes. Helen looked down the table. Then, let us find out. For the first time that morning, Richard did not command the room. He had to count it. One hand lifted, then another, then another. Victoria raised hers. A younger director raised his last, face tight with shame. The motion passed. Richard sat down slowly. The sound of the chair beneath him was small, but everyone heard the fall inside it. Malcolm watched without satisfaction. That mattered. He did not want humiliation for sport. He wanted a company to stop confusing control with leadership. Helen turned to Malcolm. Mr. Hayes, is there any path to restored financing? Richard looked up sharply. Malcolm did not answer quickly. He looked at Maya. He looked at Samuel. He looked at Nora, then at Victoria. A path, yes. The same credit line, no. Not today. Not under this board posture. Not with these omissions unresolved. Helen nodded. What would Hayes Meridian require? Elaine answered with Malcolm permission. Independent review of the altered packets and email chain. Full reconciliation of vendor aging and payroll obligations. Immediate safety audit of Factory 2 by an independent engineering firm. Written non-retaliation protections for employees, assistants, cleaning staff, and labor representatives who provide information. Creation of a board-level risk and conduct committee chaired by an independent director. Temporary removal of Richard Callaway from direct oversight of lender communications and worker relations during the review. Richard said, "This is a takeover." Malcolm said, "No, it is accountability." Helen asked, "And workers?" Malcolm looked at Maya. Worker representatives must have a formal channel into the safety review, not ceremonial, recorded, action tracked, Maya said, and overtime. Victoria answered, "We will reconcile all delayed overtime within 5 business days, if cash allows." Maya turned to her. "If cash allows has been the excuse for 6 months. Victoria accepted the hit. Then we need to publish the schedule and name what we cannot pay." Malcolm nodded. That is what honesty sounds like before it becomes comfortable. Samuel had been silent. Malcolm looked toward him. "Mr. Reed, what about building staff?" Samuel blinked. "Me?" "Yes. What would make it easier for people in this building to tell the truth before a lender has to discover it in a hallway?" Samuel glanced at Richard, then at Helen. "I do not know board language. Use hallway language." Samuel looked at the table. "Do not make people report problems to the same managers who punish them for making noise. And stop using contractors to make workers disappear on paper. A man is still part of the building, even if his paycheck comes from another company." The room absorbed that. Helen wrote it down. Richard stared at the ceiling as if the world had lost discipline. Malcolm looked at Samuel. "Thank you." Samuel nodded. It was not much, but it was more than the board had given him in 18 years. Elaine collected the signed acknowledgement of credit suspension from the table and placed it into her case. Richard refused to sign. Helen signed receipt on behalf of the board after confirming with the corporate secretary. That detail mattered. Authority had shifted in ink at 11:48, 12 minutes before Sterling North had expected final approval. Hayes Meridian formally withdrew the $50 million credit line from closing. No wire, no signature, no congratulatory handshake, no smiling photograph. Only a formal suspension notice, a preservation demand, and a room full of people finally understanding that money had walked out when dignity did. Richard sat motionless. 20 minutes earlier, he had told Malcolm to leave. Now, $50 million had obeyed. Malcolm closed his folder. "This meeting is adjourned from the bank side." Richard found his voice at last. "Mr. Hayes." Malcolm looked at him. "You made your point." "No," Malcolm said. "Mr. Reed made the point. Ms. Thompson made the point. Miss Shaw made the point. Miss Lane made the point. I only decided whether my bank would ignore it." Richard's voice dropped. "People will lose jobs." Malcolm's eyes sharpened. Then stop using workers as hostages and start treating them as the reason the company deserves to survive." He turned to leave. Then he stopped beside Samuel. The room watched. Malcolm extended his hand. "Mr. Reed, thank you for keeping the floor safe before anyone here cared who might fall." Samuel stared at the offered hand. Then he took it. His grip was rough, uncertain, and shaking. Not from weakness, from being seen. Malcolm said quietly, "Being mistaken for a good working man is not an insult to me." Samuel's eyes filled. "But what they did to you was an insult to both of us," Malcolm continued. Samuel nodded once. "Yes, sir." Behind them, Richard looked away. Victoria did not. Neither did Nora. Neither did Maya. The room had been forced to witness what it had spent years stepping around. Malcolm walked into the hallway with Elaine beside him. The credit analysts followed. Maya gathered her documents. Nora held her tablet carefully, now less like a burden and more like proof. Samuel returned to the service alcove, but he did not shrink this time. Inside the boardroom, Helen Marsh began issuing instructions. Preserve the video, call outside counsel, notify the audit committee, freeze deletion permissions, contact Factory 2, get payroll aging today. Richard, you will not contact Hayes Meridian alone. Richard stood. You are making a mistake. Helen looked at him. No, Richard, we are finally stopping one. Victoria remained standing. She opened her laptop and created a new file. Subject line, corrected risk disclosure for emergency board review. Her hands trembled as she typed, but she typed. Outside, Malcolm stopped near the elevator. Samuel had returned to the hallway with the mop bucket. The floor was dry now. The stain was gone, but the morning remained. Samuel said, "Mr. Hayes?" Malcolm turned. Samuel held out the white towel Malcolm had used earlier. It had been rinsed, wrung, and folded. "You forgot this." Malcolm took it with both hands. "Thank you." Samuel hesitated. "Do you think they will really change?" Malcolm looked through the glass at the room where power was beginning to fracture into accountability. "Some will." He paused. "Some will only learn how expensive it is not to." Samuel considered that. Then he smiled faintly. "That is a start." Malcolm looked at the towel in his hand. "Yes, Mr. Reed, it is." The elevator doors opened. Before Malcolm stepped inside, he looked once more at the boardroom screen. Final credit line approval, $50 million. The words still glowed as if the money was waiting, but the room knew better now. Money had never been the strongest thing in the building. Trust was, and Richard Calloway had spent 20 minutes destroying what his company had spent months trying to borrow. By noon, the news had not reached the public. Not yet. But inside Sterling North Tower, everyone could feel the building change. On the 47th floor, the boardroom door stayed closed. Behind the glass, the directors sat around the walnut table with no pastries touched, no celebration photograph taken, no lender signature waiting on the screen. The words, "Final credit line approval," still glowed in blue. But the approval was gone. The $50 million lifeline had been suspended. Outside the boardroom, Samuel Reed pushed his mop bucket slowly down the hallway. The floor was already clean, but old habits had weight. For 18 years, when powerful people broke something, Samuel had cleaned around it. Coffee, glass, ink, anger, silence. That morning, for the first time, he had seen power spill across the floor. And no one asked him to hide it. Nora Shaw sat on a bench near the service alcove with her cracked tablet in both hands. Elaine Porter had told her not to delete anything, not to forward anything, not to let anyone take the device without chain of custody. The words sounded legal and frightening, but they also sounded like protection. Victoria Lane came out of the boardroom at 12:37. Her face looked drained. She stopped in front of Nora. Nora stood too quickly. Victoria said, "I'm sorry." Nora blinked. "For what?" "For letting them put the truth in your hands and the fear on your shoulders." Nora looked down. "I only printed what I was told." Victoria shook her head. "No, you noticed what was wrong. And today, that mattered." Nora's eyes filled. Richard always said assistants were replaceable. Victoria looked through the glass at the boardroom, where Richard sat alone at the far end of the table while Helen Marsh spoke to outside counsel on speakerphone. Victoria's voice was quiet. Richard said many things that made weak leadership sound strong. That was the first consequence. Not the suspension, not the investigation, A woman who had stayed silent too long finally named the room correctly. At 1:15, the emergency governance session began. Richard Callaway was ordered to recuse himself from all lender communications, worker relations, and Project Harbor Line decisions while the review was active. He refused twice. The third time, Helen Marsh read the Board Authority Clause from the Bylaws, Section 7.3, Emergency Committee Powers during Material Financing Risk. Richard sat down. Authority left him one sentence at a time. Sterling North retained outside counsel from Marlowe and Finch. The Audit Committee ordered preservation of 72 hours of emails, meeting recordings, board packet versions, print logs, document metadata, and visitor check-in records. Information Technology froze deletion permissions on the Project Harbor Line shared drive at 1:42 in the afternoon. Bryce Kellen was placed on administrative leave pending review. Nora Shaw was protected under a written non-retaliation order. Maya Thompson received a formal seat in the Factory 2 safety review. Samuel Reed and the cleaning staff were included in the internal reporting channel for the first time in company history. Nobody clapped, nobody made speeches. Real accountability rarely enters a room with music. It arrives with paperwork. That evening, Malcolm Hayes sat in his office at Hayes Meridian Bank, 31 floors above Euclid Avenue. The city lights reflected against the dark window. His black leather folder rested on the desk. Beside it lay the folded white towel Samuel had returned to him. Elaine Porter stood near the door with the formal suspension file. "You did the right thing," she said. Malcolm looked at the towel. The right thing is not finished, Elaine understood. The workers, the suppliers, the payroll cycle, the plants. Richard may deserve consequences, but 3,000 people should not be punished just because their chairman confused cruelty with control. Elaine crossed the room. The bank can consider a restricted emergency facility. Smaller amount, payroll and critical suppliers only, no discretionary executive payments, no board bonuses, no public relations spend. Malcolm nodded. With independent oversight. Yes, worker safety audit first. Yes, Victoria has to produce the corrected cash bridge, and Maya has to confirm the labor risk schedule is real. Elaine looked at him. You are willing to give them a path back. Malcolm touched the towel. Not to protect the board. Then why? Because my father guarded buildings he did not own. My mother washed hospital sheets for people who never knew her name. Because Samuel Reed should not lose health insurance because Richard Callaway could not recognize his dignity. Because workers did not alter that packet. Leadership did. Elaine softened. And because you were once the man with the mop. Malcolm looked toward the window. I still am, in every room where people forget to look down. The next morning, Hayes Meridian sent Sterling North a conditional letter. Not a restoration of the $50 million line, a path. The letter offered consideration of a limited $15 million emergency payroll and supplier stabilization facility if Sterling North met immediate conditions. Complete corrected financial disclosure within 5 business days. Independent Factory 2 safety inspection within 10 business days. Written non-retaliation protections for employees, contractors, assistants, cleaning staff, and union representatives. Board-level Risk and Conduct Committee chaired by Helen Marsh. Richard Callaway removed from lender negotiations during review. No executive bonuses, buybacks, or discretionary leadership payments while emergency funds were active. Weekly reporting to Hayes Meridian and outside counsel. Maya Thompson received a copy. So did Victoria. So did Helen. So did Samuel Reed. Samuel stared at his printed copy in the break room as if someone had handed him a passport. His name was not in the letter. But people like him were. Cleaning staff, contractors, reporting protection. For the first time, the system had written space around workers who used to disappear inside other people's budgets. A younger cleaner named Teresa read over his shoulder. Does that mean they cannot fire us for talking? Samuel said, It means if they do, someone outside this building is already watching. Teresa looked down the hall. That feels different. Samuel folded the letter carefully. Yes, it did. Different did not mean easy. Sterling North entered the hardest 3 weeks in its recent history. The company had to call suppliers and admit payment delays without hiding them behind polished language. It had to publish a corrected liquidity forecast that showed the truth of its cash shortage. It had to tell workers at Factory 2 that the cracked press shield would be repaired before the line restarted, not after. It had to reconcile overtime owed across Cleveland and Youngstown. Victoria led those calls. Her voice shook during the first one, then less during the second. By the fifth, she had stopped apologizing for telling the truth and started apologizing for waiting too long to tell it. Maya did not make it easy for her. Good, Malcolm thought when Elaine told him. Trust that returns too quickly is usually pretending. At Factory 2, the independent safety inspector arrived on a cold Monday morning. He photographed the cracked shield, reviewed maintenance logs, interviewed line workers without supervisors present, and issued an immediate stop-use recommendation on the affected press. Production slowed. Richard called it a disaster. Maya called it a near miss finally being named, and Helen called it a cost of not listening earlier. Samuel watched the changes from the building floor, where people now lowered their voices less when executives passed. Not everyone became kind. Not every director suddenly learned humility. Some only learned caution. But even caution can protect people while conscience catches up. Nora kept her job. More than that, she was moved under the chief legal office during the review, so she no longer reported to Bryce. When the information technology team imaged her tablet, Elaine sent a Hayes Meridian observer to document chain of custody. Nora cried in the restroom after it was done, not because she was sad, but because nobody had ever treated her fear like evidence before. Bryce Kellen resigned before the review ended. Richard Calloway fought longer. He sent emails defending his leadership. He called the suspension an overreaction. He claimed Malcolm Hayes had personalized a financing decision. He told 2 directors that no bank would walk away from Sterling North forever because the assets were too strong. Helen Marsh replied with one sentence, "Assets do not repair broken trust by themselves." By the end of the month, Richard was removed as executive chairman pending the full audit. His name remained on old plaques in the lobby, but his voice no longer controlled the room. That was the second consequence. Power did not vanish. It was taken out of his hands and placed under review. 2 months later, Sterling North returned to Hayes Meridian. Not to the old meeting. That meeting was gone. This new meeting took place in the same glass boardroom on floor 47, but the room looked different because the people inside it behaved differently. The blue screen did not say final credit line approval. It said corrected risk review. No one laughed when Samuel Reed entered. No one asked why Maya Thompson was there. No one told Nora to stand against the wall. Victoria sat near the front with a thick binder labeled Restated Liquidity and Labor Risk Disclosure. Helen Marsh chaired the meeting. Richard Calloway was not present. His chair had been removed from the head of the table and placed against the wall for overflow seating. That small detail did not escape Malcolm. He noticed rooms. He always had. Samuel stood near the screen in his blue work shirt. He had tried to wear a tie, but it sat crooked. Teresa from the cleaning team had straightened it twice before he entered. Malcolm sat across from him. "Mr. Reed," Helen said, "thank you for joining us." Samuel looked around the room. Nobody had ever thanked him for entering that boardroom before. He cleared his throat. "I am not here to talk about money," Malcolm said. "That is why we need you." Samuel nodded. The new reporting system works better because people can speak to someone outside their direct supervisor, but some contract staff still worry. If they report something, they need to know they will still have hours next week. Helen wrote that down. Maya added, contract workers should be included in all safety communications. If they clean around machinery, chemicals, spills, or loading areas, they are part of the risk environment. Victoria nodded, agreed. No one rolled their eyes. No one called it factory noise. Samuel looked at Malcolm, and for 1 second, the 2 men remembered the coffee spill. A floor can tell you what a board packet hides. After Samuel, Maya presented the Factory 2 update. The cracked press shield had been replaced. Lockout maintenance training had been repeated. 2 supervisors who told workers to keep complaints verbal were removed from safety authority. Overtime reconciliation had begun, with dates and amounts disclosed. Victoria presented the corrected financials. They were ugly. That made Malcolm trust them more. Accounts payable was still stretched. Cash remained tight. 2 vendor relationships needed repair. The company would need discipline for at least 4 quarters. But now the report named the risks instead of burying them. Malcolm listened for almost 2 hours. He asked precise questions. No one tried to flatter him. That helped. Elaine asked for confirmation that the board risk committee would meet monthly and include worker safety reports. Helen confirmed. Maya confirmed. Victoria confirmed that any amended credit use would exclude executive bonuses until worker obligations and critical suppliers were current. Finally, the room went quiet. Everyone knew the decision had arrived. Malcolm closed the binder. 2 months ago, this company asked my bank for $50 million while hiding the truth from itself. Today, you have not solved every problem, but you have started telling the truth in the same room where the money is requested. Victoria lowered her eyes. Helen waited. Malcolm continued. Hayes Meridian will not restore the original credit line today. Trust does not return because a company holds one better meeting. No one argued. That was another sign of change. But, Malcolm said, the bank will open the first $20 million tranche under enhanced oversight. Funds will be restricted to payroll stabilization, critical suppliers, safety remediation, and approved working capital needs. Further access will depend on verified reporting, labor protections, and continued governance compliance. A long breath moved through the room. Not victory. Relief with responsibility attached. Maya asked, "Worker protections remain written into the conditions?" "Yes," Samuel asked. "Contract staff too?" Malcolm looked at him. "Especially contract staff." Samuel nodded. Victoria wiped her eyes once. Helen said, "Thank you, Mr. Hayes." Malcolm answered, "Thank the people who told you the truth before the company ran out of time." His eyes moved to Samuel, to Maya, to Nora, to Victoria, then to the empty place where Richard's chair used to be. After the meeting, Malcolm walked alone into the hallway. Samuel was there with the mop bucket again because work did not end when Dignity arrived. But something was different. A young director came out carrying a stack of binders and dropped 2 folders near the service alcove. Papers scattered across the marble. For 1 second, the old building held its breath. Then the director crouched and began picking them up himself. Samuel bent too. The director looked at him. "Sorry, Mr. Reed, I have it." Samuel studied him, then handed him 1 folder. "Floor is slippery near the corner." The director looked down. "I will call facilities." Samuel raised an eyebrow. "You are talking to facilities." The director froze. Then he laughed, embarrassed. "Right, sorry." Samuel smiled faintly. Different did not mean perfect, but it was still different. At the elevator, Malcolm turned back. Samuel stood in the hall, not invisible, not decorative, not background cost. A man with a name, a witness, a worker who had always understood the building better than the men who claimed to own it. Malcolm reached into his pocket and touched the brass janitor key he still carried after all these years. His father had given it to him with one instruction: never forget which doors taught you. The elevator opened. Elaine waited inside. Malcolm stepped in, but before the doors closed, he looked once more at Sterling North Boardroom. A room could change, but only after someone refused to pretend it had been clean all along. 3 months after the first meeting, Sterling North released a public governance update. It did not mention Malcolm insult directly. Legal departments rarely write poetry, but it named the reforms: independent safety oversight, restated financial disclosures, worker reporting protections, contract staff inclusion, board risk committee, executive compensation restrictions during recovery, leadership transition. The stock price fell, then stabilized. Suppliers returned slowly. Workers remained cautious. Trust did not flood back. It came in drops. A paid overtime check, a repaired press shield, a supervisor removed, a janitor thanked by name, an assistant promoted out of fear, a board packet that finally matched the truth. Samuel kept a copy of the public update in his locker. Beside it, he taped a small note Nora had written after the second meeting. "Mr. Reed, thank you for saying the floor was cold." He read that note on hard days. There were still hard days, of course there were. But now, when he pushed his mop down the hallway on floor 47, people moved differently around him. Some said good morning, some moved their own chairs, some only nodded because shame had not yet learned language. Samuel accepted all of it without confusing manners for justice. He knew the difference now. So did Malcolm. One evening, long after the second credit tranche was approved, Malcolm returned to Hayes Meridian and sat alone in his office. He placed the folded white towel from Sterling North beside the brass key on his desk. A towel. A key. 2 small things that carried a life. He thought of his mother at the kitchen table, placing tea beside his finance textbook. Do not let their blindness become your mirror. He had not. He had let it become a window Through it, he saw Samuel, Nora, Maya, Victoria, 3,000 workers whose names never appeared on the first slide, and one chairman who learned too late that dignity is not a courtesy powerful people distribute when convenient. It is the minimum price of trust. The next time someone in a polished room laughs at the person holding a mop, remember Sterling North. Remember Richard Calloway pointing at the door. Remember the red camera light blinking above the glass. Remember the altered packet, the hidden safety note, the assistant who saved the email, the union representative who refused to whisper, and the janitor who knew the building was cold before the board admitted the heat was failing. Most of all, remember Malcolm Hayes. He did not shout, not. He did not beg to be recognized. He did not need to prove his worth to people who mistook arrogance for intelligence. He simply waited until the truth entered the room. Then he closed the folder, and $50 million followed him out. Because respect should not require a title, trust should not depend on a suit, and the person you dismiss as just the janitor may be the one person who sees exactly how dirty the room has become.